the children who couldn't afford the meal. So in the 1960s, we had a big scandal about hunger in the United States. Some of you may be familiar with this story about Bobby Kennedy going to Mississippi for some hearings and being introduced to hunger in its most intense and starkest forms in the Mississippi Delta. And in that period of his life, which was near the end of his life, pretty much anything Bobby Kennedy did was news, and the news picked up on these discoveries in the Delta, and hunger became a public issue in the United States overnight. And when committees and commissions, and in this case the National Committee on School Lunch Participation, which was a coalition of 5 women's organizations, took a close look at the food programs, the women's organizations that looked at school food, they found was that the program was basically serving affluent communities much better than it was serving poor communities, and that the great majority of low-income children in the United States were not able to participate in the school food program because they couldn't afford the meals, and the schools did not or were not allocating the resources to feed them. So big change in the very late 60s, early 70s, created a national system with national eligibility standards, thresholds, and 3 tiers, free, reduced price, and full price. And most importantly, the federal government picking up the cost of the full price meals and all but the reduced price of the reduced price meals. Right now it's typically 40 cents for lunch. So the federal government pays $2.68 for a full price, for a free meal, and $2.28 for a reduced price meal, and still there's a subsidy of about 25 cents that goes into the so-called full price meal. So that's the financing structure. And that worked fairly well for a while through the 70s. School lunch participation rose dramatically. Food service directors tell me that it was sort of their golden years because participation was growing and they had these substantial subsidies coming in to pay for the free and reduced price meals. But they also had a pretty hefty, at that point, subsidy to help keep the price of the so-called full price meals down. So they had happy cafeterias as they look back on it. But there were changes brewing in our society, and a lot of them had to do with the overall level of federal expenditure. Here in California, your aunts and uncles, or possibly your grandparents, pioneered a taxpayers' revolt on Proposition 13, introducing a whole new ideology and energy around the idea of limiting federal expenditures, particularly for domestic programs. And Ronald Reagan was elected with believing that that was his mandate, his agenda, and he turned his attention to school food in something called the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981. And if you've been following the debates over health care, you know that this notion of budget reconciliation as a way to get legislation through is with us again. But in any case, very briefly, together the 1980 and 1981 Budget Reconciliation Acts reduced the subsidy that applied to all meals. Okay, cut that subsidy by 1/3. It raised the reduced price that the reduced price kids had to pay, and reduced the level of eligibility. It used to be 190% of poverty, they got it down to 180% of poverty. It cut back on the commodities, and it instituted new, much more strenuous accountability regulations, oversight of the handling of this money, and what food service operators call counting and claiming. It's when they have to count how many of the meals served in any particular day were served to children who, students who paid the full price, how many to people who paid a reduced price, and how many to people who were eligible for free. Every meal has to be accounted for so as to get the accurate level of reimbursement. It's a system that is absolutely error-prone from day one. The net effect, 2,700 schools left the program, so in those schools nobody got a free lunch from then on. The school systems lost about 1/4 of the paying customers because the subsidy for the paying meal had been cut quite dramatically, and it's part of the sort of lore of school lunch that if you raise the price of school lunch by any significant increment in 1 year, you'll lose a lot of customers. And they did, in fact, lose 1/4 of their paying customers over the next few years. This was also the era in which many school systems locally were running out of money. Pension plans were beginning to come due. Environmental considerations were raising the cost of doing business in some ways. Teachers' unions were being more effective in their demands. Local school systems were less and less willing to put any money into school food. Here in California, you call it encroachment. I've not run into that term in any other state, but if the local school system, school budget, has to put money into the cafeteria service, it's called encroaching on the school budget. So that gives you some sense of how it's viewed. And this was also a period when schools were losing some of the federal subsidies that had helped with other issues. So this created what you might call a crisis in the cafeteria. Okay, here's your food service operator, your child nutrition director or director of school food service, and she's got fewer customers and lower subsidies and smaller amount of commodities, and meanwhile she's having to engage more effort in accounting. They say we want to be bean cookers, not bean counters, and they really do prefer to work on food. So what are they going to do? And there basically were two strategies. On the one side, you try to increase the revenue, and they did this by trying to lure those full price or paying customers, as they think of them, back into the cafeteria. And I probably could ask you what you think they did, but in the interest of moving along, I'll tell you. They did two things. One was they began to adjust the menu, thinking that it would appeal to youngsters more if it was more like fast food. So they began offering more fries and shakes and burgers and nuggets and what have you. And the other was they began selling items a la carte, okay, on the belief that this would help their revenue stream. So that's really, I mean, there had been competitive foods in the schools. The technical term for all foods that are sold outside of the nutritionally regulated, federally reimbursed meal is competitive foods, and that applies to anything in the vending machines in the hall, anything in the snack shop. If you're having a bake sale to raise money for a team, that's competitive foods, but it's also the a la carte items in the cafeteria. And there had been very small amounts of competitive foods in the schools before this crisis in the early 80s, and it just mushroomed overnight because food service saw it as salvation. But then there's the other side, okay? You're going to increase your revenues and you're going to cut costs. And generally speaking, the strategy for cutting costs was to replace scratch cooking, cooking on site, with bulk convenience food. That's those brown boxes with the box cutters and the defrost and reheat. This helps to reduce costs because the labor hours are reduced. It takes less labor. Now, another way to look at that is that it eliminates jobs. And I have to tell you that from a social policy point of view, the jobs that it eliminates are jobs that are compatible with child rearing. Okay, these were good jobs for families that were trying to juggle all those competing roles of breadwinning and child rearing. Those are the jobs that got shrunk and often eliminated. If you can keep people under a certain number of hours, what in the industry they call short hours, you may not have to pay them pension and health benefits. And so not only is it fewer hours of labor, but those hours turn out to be cheaper because they don't incur the fringe benefit cost. Or, if you want to look at it from the question of what kind of society do we want, you're moving people from relatively secure jobs with a stake in the society and access to the benefits that families need in order to do a good job with their role as caregivers, to jobs that are precarious, jobs that don't have health care, sick leave, pension, that sort of benefit. I'm going to read you an excerpt because there's another element to this. Okay. On the cost side of the break-even equation, efforts to reduce labor costs had similar impact on menus. Food service operators found that they could reduce the cost per meal by replacing the fresh preparation of food on site with bulk convenience foods. Such changes not only permitted schools to reduce total labor hours, they also allowed the substitution of less skilled workers for employees with cooking skills.